Good afternoon and welcome to today's presentation, Unplanned Events or Black Swans and How to Avoid Them. The information presented by the expert is not to be used as legal advice and does not indicate a working relationship with the expert. All materials obtained from this presentation are merely for educational purposes and should not be used in a court of law sans the expert's consent, i.e. a business relationship where she or he is hired for your particular case. In today's webinar, Dave Russell will discussing evaluating presenting industrial risk, analyzing risk, the value of fat-tailed statistical thinking, predict types of events, difference between the EU's approach to risk management thinking versus the U.S. approach. To give you a little background about our presenter, David Russell is a professional engineer and the president of Global Environmental Operations Incorporated in Georgia. He has over 40 years in the environmental and chemical business and has written several books on environmental and security topics. He lectures on security and risk as well as practical environmental and industrial topics in the Middle East and Far East. He has been involved in several high-profile remedial investigations, and he has investigated contamination and remediation all over the world and has lectured on handling of hazardous waste and materials as well as safety and security. Attendees who require passcode, the word for today is unplanned. During the Q&A session, we ask that you enter this passcode into the Q&A widget for CLE reporting purposes. The Q&A is located to the left of your screen. Please remember that if you're applying for CLE credit, you must log onto your computer as yourself and stay for the full 60 minutes. You are also required to complete the survey at the end of the program. Please note that CLE credit cannot be given to those watching together on a single computer. Tomorrow morning, we will send out an email with a link to the archive recording of the webinar. The slides can be downloaded from the resource list at the widget at the bottom of your screen. Thank you all for attending today, and Dave, the presentation is now turned over to you.
Thank you. I'm Dave Russell, and we're going to talk a little bit about unplanned events or black swans and how to avoid them. This is a brief introduction to risk assessment. There is a reading list that you may find very helpful, and that is the second edition of a book called The Black Swan, or The Impact of Highly Improbable, with the new section on robustness and fragility. Fooled by randomness, the hidden role of chance and life in the markets, anti-fragile things can be gained from disorder. All of these are by Nassim Taleb, who was a trader on Wall Street. And while his particular thinking is primarily to the practice of financial losses, it has certain implications with regard to industrial operations. And that's kind of what we're going to be covering. So what are black swans? Black swans are the disproportionate role of high-profile, hard-to-predict, and rare events that are beyond the realm of normal expectations in history, science, finance, and technology. The non-computability of the probability of the consensual rare events using scientific methods, owing to the very nature of small probabilities. The psychological biases which we all have, which blind people, both individually and collectively, to uncertainty and rare events' massive role in historical affairs. In other words, a black swan is the unpredictable, that which can't happen but which does, and which no one expected except by hindsight. Black swans, in short, arise from risk. There are a number of historical black swan events in the fairly recent past, and we're going to cover some of those. All right, let's start with the basics as to what is risk. Risk is anything which can harm. I've define this as anything which can harm because this is the nature of the type of activity. There is a technical basis for risk. Risk is the consequences following a successful attack times the likelihood of the adversary of the success times the likelihood of the attack being attempted. In other words, basically, it's the cost, the damage, times the probability of the attack, times the probability of the event being successful. So, risk is nonlinear and is irregularly distributed. The following graph there shows it's a histogram of individual scaled non-negligible claim sizes based on Texas windstorm data. It's a good parameter fit to about 95% level. But notice that it is a fat-tailed, what we call fat-tailed. It goes far out to the right. And the black swans appear in those areas. And that's where the greatest damage is done. One of the problems we all have is that we were probably all raised on standard statistical thinking, students T, normal, so on and so forth. And we're used to the idea of 1, 2, 3, or even 6 sigma events if you're into some of the more current black belt management techniques. Black swans are 6 sigma and beyond. It's the catastrophic thing that nobody has really considered. Also the thing that happens when somebody says, well, that's never going to happen here. It's an event which, highly improbable, does occur. All right. How do we measure risk assessment? Well, first thing is that most risk assessments are partial because a full risk assessment is a very complex, time-consuming, and difficult thing. You have hundreds, perhaps, of possibilities, and to evaluate each one and try and put some sort of numerical estimate on how frequent, how likely, how successful it might be is often considered non-functional. A complete risk or threat assessment considers the full spectrum of threats, natural processes, man-made, and the likelihood of occurrence of each threat, as I said before. For natural threats, historical data concerning frequency of occurrence for given natural disasters such as tornadoes, hurricanes, flood, fire, or earthquakes can be used to determine the credibility of that given threat. Fortunately, in the United States, we have not had a real terroristic threat against an industrial facility, or they have been so extremely rare. Does that mean that they're not going to happen? No. That's a type of black swan event which could happen. And we're going to discuss a bit of how we go about assessing the type of activity. All right. As part of the criminal assessment, it requires outside resources. You have to be in contact with the police, the fire, the FBI, the local planning committee, and so on and so forth, because they have the resources in the community that can provide some sort of assessment or likelihood that there may be some deranged or disconsolate persons out there who have a grudge against a particular facility. The other thing that you have to look at is the type of assets and or the activity located at the facility. If it's a very highly visible asset, it may increase the attractiveness in the eyes of the aggressor. For example, a large chemical plant, very wealthy chemical plant, adjacent to a very poor community. This might, for example, generate some envy, some suspicion, and all kinds of rumors. In years past, when we were into the collieries, coal mining industry, and to the certain types of textile and fabric industries, there was a bit of this. It was held down by the fact that a lot of this was in company towns and that the company was responsible for putting people into houses and so on and so forth. They knew that if they got too riled up about the working conditions, all of a sudden they might lose their house. So it's not to say that these things don't exist. It's to say that sometimes they're controlled better. All right. One of the other things we have to look at is the type of assets. Activity located in the facility will also directly relate to the likelihood of various types of accidents. Are you handling gas? Are you handling highly flammable liquids? Do you have a lot of difficult or poisonous operations? Things which could harm the community? The knowledge about what's going on in the plant is seldom, if ever, contained. And it does leak out into the community. As somebody has a real bad grudge against the facility, it can be a problem. Similarly, simple things like strikes or whatever, especially strikes in chemical plants and other types of plants, can cause disruptions because of sabotage. Simple sabotage. All right, the risks and threats from negligence and lack of proper supervision are often greater than the threats from natural occurrences or terrorist threats because they involve people and daily activities. The point here is that it depends upon how well the management responds to the management of the facility. Have they allowed sloppy practices to creep in? Or, for example, if you have a control board operator, does the operator's console, can it be tied to outside? Is there a way that somebody could, for example, slip in a CD and make some changes in the operating procedures or operating structure? How tight or how better controlled are the various links that you have to control valves, to machinery, and so on? Are those things critical? A lot of what's going on in industry today is no longer wired controls, but it is open Wi-Fi control. Is the Wi-Fi system locked so that a control valve or a switch or whatever cannot be triggered by somebody from the outside coming in? There are some good databases out there, and the best accessible form is from the UK, their Health Safety Executive, which I'll discuss a little bit later. But it's a good idea to be aware of some of these databases because they can provide useful information. All right, how do we measure and express risks and threats? The easiest form is by using a simple graph. You have a vulnerability rating, high, very high, moderate, low, and a criticality rating. Those things which are both critical to the operation of the facility and vulnerable need attention, and so on. Something that has a very high vulnerability but medium criticality may not require as much attention, or it can be used to impact or delay the security or whatever other procedures you may need to control the risk. But this is a way to present this information in a very simple format that's readily, easily understandable. Now, what are the countermeasures? Well, the countermeasures may be things like additional controls, additional security, changing the operation, reformulating as necessary, limiting the quantities of materials available. There's all kinds of things one can do to lower the risk without necessarily changing the process substantially. But the point is that you need to think in these terms about, okay, number one, what is the risk? How severe is it? And then what can we do to control it? Obviously, if you're talking about very high risks and very high criticality, these are the areas which you are going to spend the most money on and the soonest. By comparison, something that has low vulnerability and low criticality is something that you probably won't be looking at. For example, the latter, something like a flat tire on a truck is probably low vulnerability and very low criticality. Something can be repaired. A fire or explosion in a process would have a very high criticality and a very high vulnerability. So you have to think in those terms, and then you can use this type of setup to decide how rapidly or how much you're going to spend out of your finite capital budgets on these areas. But you should try and at least get the red and pink areas as well controlled as you can within the constraints of the capital budget. All right, that's one way to express risk. There is, if you need to put it in terms of financial arrangements, then let's start looking at annual loss expectation. Annual loss expectation, you start with the estimated replacement cost, usually in terms of millions of dollars. And then the frequency of occurrence of undesirable events. What happens is, in order to make this simple, what they've done is basically say 300 days, which is an operating period, is approximately 1 year. Now, we all know it's 365, but for the purposes of argument here, this will give us a rough guide. Something that occurs with an F1 frequency, very low frequency, would have something like a major earthquake like Charleston, South Carolina in 1866. That was a magnitude 5. Certainly the San Francisco earthquake, although I might rate that a little bit higher, because that might have because of the geologic conditions. F2 would be the type of event such as Savannah had an earthquake. Now, these are coastal cities, South Carolina and Georgia, and are not known for their unstable geologic conditions. Matter of fact, they're extremely stable geologic conditions. 1 every 3 years, an F3, damaging tropical storm with flooding. 1 every 100 days, something like a tank overfilling and a spill, or an in-plant collision. 1 every 10 days, thermal process fire out of control, specifications, a fire hazard. It could be another type of internal accident within the facility, within a storage facility. 1 a day. If you have hydrogen in the process, piping leaks could create a fire hazard. 10 a day would be an F7. And the point is that how serious are these things? You do this in terms of calculated annual loss expectations. And the formula is n to the power of F plus n minus 3 over 3. And when we look at it graphically, I think it'll become a little bit clearer. The value of F decreases across the top. So the highest values, the highest damage will be up in the red areas. That will be highest annual loss expectation. Get below, say, a value of 7 or 8 on the value of N, and maybe below a value of 5 on the value of F, then you're in areas where your capital expenditures scaled back or postponed a little while. Does that mean that they should not be addressed? No. That means that they should be addressed. But it may be not immediately, maybe within the normal operating schedule of the next 4 to 5 years or whatever. The point is that you have to have a good feel for how much you have in the way of a capital budget, plus a frequency of how critical it is to do the upgrades, to do the protection, to spend the additional resources. Now, will it change? Sure. It should change in respect or with respect to the risk, but we all know it doesn't. But this is a way to get at least a beginning handle on the type of risk and the type of assessment, so that you can present at least a capital budget to plant management or make some estimate as to what the risk might be. The one thing I should say is that this is not an isolated situation. It's going to require a committee effort, probably 3, 4, 5 different disciplines, all looking at the operations of the facility, all with different skills, some electrical, some physical, some mechanical, some environmental, other types of things that may be there. Other things that you're going to have to consider in your risk assessment would be, for example, the consequences of regulatory action. How likelihood, given the fact that incident A occurred, what are the total costs? Well, in looking at the cost, you're going to have to look at the physical damage to the facility, plus associated costs. And the associated costs can be horrendous. They can be much, much higher than the actual cost to the facility. For example, if you have your widget manufacturing shut down for 6 months while you're doing some repairs due to a fire or an explosion or a terrorist attack or something gone awry, what is the total cost in lost sales? What is the cost in reputation? All of these things should go into your overall calculation of what risk really is. So the lowest value of risk is the lowest risk occurrence. That's where you devote the least amount of money. The highest value, the highest annual risk is where you devote the most amount of money. And it may not be a one-year thing. It may be a multi-year activity. But the point is you're trying to get the risk under some sort of control. Now, what does a black swan cost? We just talked about some of this. But it's whatever you want to make it, up to including the total destruction of the facility, life, lost, damages, property damage, rebuilding costs, lost sales, market share, quality of the reputation, all kinds of things. Category 9 black swan and all the black swan events is dependent upon the frequency and how it is measured. The point I made earlier about distributions. Normal distributions are shown on the left there. Black swan and Mother Nature have a different distribution, fat-tailed distribution, often called a Weibull type distribution, shown on the right. And you can see that they are a different point because, for one, they have no zero. And they stretch out much further than your normal activity would project. So you're out beyond in some cases out beyond the 5 and 6 sigma black belt ranges for quality control. You're out in some of the areas that are 9 and 10 sigma and still have a huge potential impact on the facility. All right, we've been going at it for about 28 minutes. I'm going to give you folks a chance to give some questions.
Thank you. If all the attendees can enter in the passcode for today, which is unplanned, and any questions that you have for Dave. Also, please remember that if you are applying for CLE credit, you must attend for the full 60 minutes of the presentation. First question, what causes black swan events?
That's hard to really say. I think a lot of black swan events, some of the more recent ones, are due to management failure to recognize the fact that they've gotten sloppy. And what do I mean by sloppy? Situations where, oh, well, we have procedures, but we don't really follow them. Or I've described an event and the plant manager or the vice president may say, I don't know. I think this is not likely to happen. The point being that if it does happen, there may be a huge loss of life. I was dealing a few years back with a situation out in California where they had an ammonia tank, liquid ammonia, on a flight line adjacent to a large or medium-sized metropolitan area. If there had been any problems, and it's a highly improbable event, but if there had been a problem where they had a plane land on or clip or do anything with those tanks, they would have had an event which could have handled or involved maybe 500,000 people. And that's a true black swan. Next question.
Sure. In your opinion, has the government's lax attitude towards gun ownership and regulation and their attitude towards mentally unstable persons make the risk much higher in the U.S. versus other first world countries?
That's a tough one because the prevalence of weapons in certain societies is kind of a given. We get a lot more attention to it in the United States, but if you look at the facilities and the incidence of gun activities, actually it seems to be falling from the data I've seen, and it may not be as critical. Certainly it's a nasty event when you wind up with someone coming into an area where they are discharging a firearm against unprotected civilians. Is that worthwhile of increasing sensitivity? Yeah, perhaps. The most recent example was the Facebook. Yeah, it was Facebook the other day. Or, I'm sorry, YouTube. How does one measure the likelihood of community or individual discontent? In that case, it was kind of difficult. But there was a warning. Was it followed? Apparently not. So I can't really answer that except from I can't answer that from a database standpoint, except by the idea of a perception. I've been to the Middle East. I've been to the Far East. Some of these countries are notably wild and woolly, and they have a different attitude toward the value of human life. And it's a lot of this, I think, is dependent upon a lot of the publicity which we see regarding various types of events and publicizing certain things. Okay, next question.
Next question. How does Black Swan theory dovetail into Lean Six Sigma?
Well, Black Swan, again, we've got a Lean Six Sigma is based on a standard statistical distribution. And there's a formula for that. And we've all used it at one point or another. A Black Swan event, or when you're looking at risk events, you're looking at a Weibull type distribution, which is an entirely different distribution. If you'll notice, for example, and let me give you a very brief example. I've been in the environmental business for a number of years, and almost any plant you want to talk about has never had a facility which has turned water back onto the environment cleaner than it has been taken in, especially cooling processes. But yet, if you look at statistical calculation, standard statistical events, that should occur, or it might occur. It doesn't, because it's a whole different theory and a whole different basis. The Black Swan event doesn't have, it starts from zero and goes upward, rather than a standard statistical event, which can go either side of the 0 point. Does that answer your question?
Thanks, Dave. You can continue with the presentation.
Okay. One of the other things I want to make you aware of is that the EU uses a slightly different approach to evaluating the potential for black swans, hazardous accidents. Their risk analysis uses certain specific steps. First, they identify the risk, collect the data, then they come up with an event tree and scenario definitions, and from that they use and make a risk estimate and the effects, and then a risk calculation. Now we're going to kind of step through some of these in some sort of fashion. First of all, what is an event tree? An event tree, it looks in some cases like a badly distorted Christmas tree, but basically you have various decision points and you have legs of decision and legs of probability for each particular thing. One of the best and most recent decision trees that I've seen, or event tree, was for Deepwater Horizons. If you go on the Deepwater Horizons site, you can actually find an analysis, and it's a very complex analysis. It stretches over several pages, several hundred decision points. They're trying to find out why certain events occurred that led to the Deepwater Horizons failure. But the point is that on each one of these legs, at each one of these junction points, you have a probability. The probability of one occurring or the other occurring, and sometimes it can be 3 or 4 events all on a particular leg. So it's not just a simple point. This looks like, when it's done, if you plot it vertically, it looks like the inverse of a tree. That's how it's got its name. All right. The EU's approach to risk analysis for this type of incident evaluates many parameters. One of the things that they do, and we're talking primarily about cartage or transportation-related incidents. People killed or injured during the or shortly after the accident. Good case in point would be 5 or 6 years ago, there was that accident with a chlorine tank up in South Carolina. It kind of flooded the valley with gaseous chlorine and did all kinds of damage. I don't believe there were that many people killed, but I'm not sure. I haven't looked at it in some time. Damage to important buildings and structures, whether it's liquid or whether it's gas, all kinds of situations where, for example, you can find that there may be a tank of acid right next to the roadway, and what's the protection of that if somebody happens to careen into it? All right. If you're doing some sort of transportation of something that has a hazardous material to it, what's the potential for environmental pollution linked to a cargo release? If there's a spill, and it doesn't necessarily have to be, well, this is specifically for transportation related, but it can be, what is the potential for environmental pollution if you have a spill or release? You have several things. For example, the scenarios which you might want to develop would be the possibility of explosion, flash fire or pool fire. What are the consequences of an atmospheric release due to a burn or just an evaporation release? And how about the contamination of water or soil? Each of these has a specific cost element identified with it. And you can calculate the damage from these depending upon the scenario you develop. So the relevant information that you're going to need is you're going to have to make an estimate of population density and time of day, traffic density and congestion, type and use of surrounding structures, accessibility of emergency services, atmospheric conditions, worst case and both worst case and most likely, and the topography of the area. For example, in Georgia, the Georgia Board of Education requires a risk assessment for the construction of new schools that includes things like location and proximity to airports and possibility of major transportation incidents and things like that. And in some cases, we've even gone in and calculated the likelihood of a transportation accident with involving a gasoline cargo in front of or near a school. What's the likelihood? What's the damage? How critical is it? So, anyhow, after you pull all these numbers together, what you wind up doing is you wind up with a frequency, and the Europeans do a calculation based on fatalities. The bottom axis there is fatalities. The top and the vertical axis is the likelihood of frequency. And you can see that the larger the fatality, the much lower the probability. This is an estimate, but it's based on a number of specific factors. This in particular was transport of dangerous goods through road tunnels, and the references there at the bottom. It is possible to make these type of estimates, and you can, with some degree of certainty, say that, okay, if this happens, it can be a real problem. Hence, for example, my case of the California ammonia tank under the airport flight ran. However, the U.S. could never follow this approach. Lawyers and liability. I'm going to ask you a question. How could an industrial executive, vice president, CEO, or whatever, justify an activity which might be creating an unacceptable risk, no matter how slight that risk? He'd get crucified, and the company would get crucified for producing something very much like this data. Think about the lawyers and the liability for a CEO, and then try and defend this type of graph. Unacceptable risk is when you have high frequency, high casualty. Tolerable risk is as low as reasonably possible. That's in the yellow. Acceptable risk is in the orange. Acceptable risk is in the green. And still, look at the fatalities. Talking between 10 and 100 people killed, with a frequency of 10 to the minus 7th to 10 to the minus 9th. If that ever occurs, you've got a major problem in your hand. Possible solutions. And determine F, the frequency, from historical data. Rail, roadway, airline, and other statistics. Recent moves by Homeland Security have made movement data on some types of shipments unavailable. Traffic and emergency data are still available. For example, in the case I talked about with the school, I had to call up the fire department to find out how many in the past, whatever their database was, how many hazmat incidents they had ever had along a certain particular stretch of highway. As it turned out, they didn't have any. All right, what do you do then? Well, then you've got a very unlikely situation, but you still have to come up with some sort of estimate as to what the possible risk might be. So you've got a possible hazard times an almost uncalculable event frequency. At some point, you have to draw the line. Now, in the UK and the EU, there are guidelines on risk assessment. They call this the colored books, and I've given you references on each of them to download them. They're quite thorough. The assessment of carriage of dangerous goods by rail. Green Book is methods of determining possible damage to people and objects resulting from the release of hazardous materials. That deals with gas and some liquids. Orange Books, risk management principles and concepts. The Purple Book is guidelines for quantitative risk assessment. Red Book is methods for determining and processing probabilities. Yellow Book is methods for the calculation of physical effects due to the releases of hazardous materials. I've summarized that a bit on the next slide there. Detailed contents of the colored books. And see, you may find in going through them that some of these things don't apply, some of them do apply, and you may or may not want to use all of it. But for example, the Yellow Book, there's outflows, spray releases, pool evaporation, cloud and vapor dispersion, heat from flux fires, vessel ruptures. And the thing is, the Red Book contains various types of probability analyses. Purple Book guideline for quantitative risk assessment, loss of containment events, source term modeling. Orange Books is risk management and appetite for risk, how to identify it. And then Green Book is radiation explosive effects on humans and buildings. Primarily, this is an air pollution, but it does discuss things like shelter in place, calculation of people and exposure. And then the carriage by rail, it does describe a framework for evaluating carriage accidents. In the U.S., there are certain types of activities and certain types of programs that are available. For example, ADIOS is a free program by EPA. It's the Oil Spill Analysis Program. The Chemical Reactivity Worksheet, if you're into this type of activity, the Chemical Reactivity Worksheet is by EPA and NOAA. Again, it's an app. I happen to have it on my phone. There's the Cameo Suite, which is both an app and it can be more complex. But it is the computer-aided management of emergency operations. And specifically, it includes Aloha. Aloha is principally for dispersive releases and includes some toxicity data. But the real advantage of it is that you can lay a map underneath Aloha, and it will give you the approximate parameters, very conservative, mind you, but it will give you the approximate parameters of a specific event based upon the quantity, the wind conditions, the solar radiation, and so on. Carver plus shock is a process-based flow sheet program used primarily in the food industry to determine routes of contamination, but it is highly adaptable to chemical and other industries. And the point here is, if you look at Carver plus shock, it does identify those primary physical things. They're focused on ways of contamination coming into the facility. You don't necessarily need to take it that far, but it'll help you focus your thinking. All right, there's CAFE, which is Chemical Aquatic Fate Effects Database. So if you spill something in water, you can start to assess what it might happen. There's also the Dow Hazard Index. Dow's Fire and Explosion Index Hazard Classification Guide, 7th edition, published by AICHE, is an extremely useful tool for citing locations of tanks and equipment, so on. And then, finally, OSHA has PSM, which is Process Safety Management. And that's for some new and some existing facilities. You go through and look at the facility with a group, and you wind up making decisions as to, could this happen, could it not happen, how likely is it to happen, what do we need to do to better control this, to reduce the hazard of incident or increase the management safety. Another good reference is Critical Infrastructure and Protection Homeland Security by Ted Lewis. He's the director of the Naval Postgraduate School for Homeland Security, and he's primarily talking about things like networking and the types of hazards that may occur when you have network facilities. So those are some of the tools that you may find very useful. Now I want to talk about some of the specifics of the types of things that you can think about with black swans. 1984 in December, drought in central India caused crop production to go way down and affected the demand for 7, which was a chemical which was produced by Union Carbide. Union Carbide made a decision to produce 7 primarily by methyl isocyanate route. Methyl isocyanate is a nasty reactive chemical. Union Carbide allowed poor siting of the plant with inadequate plant area. In other words, for example, they had a buffer, but they allowed the community to develop right along the fence line. As a consequence, when they had a gas release, it was still a high toxicity event. In 1984, they had budget cuts in maintenance, and pressure indicators in the operators' boards were inaccurate due to leaks. They failed to follow safety and maintenance operating procedures, including simple things like installation of a slip line, because they were shorthanded and it was easier to just forget about certain things than to do a certain thing. Install a slip line to prevent maintenance. And this allowed water to enter the methyl isocyanate tank. Well, methyl isocyanate is highly reactive with water. And when that occurred, it generates heat. And here's a graphic of what is the possible or allowable routes. failure of good enforcement safety practices, poor to minimal supervision on the night shift, management failures, inadequate risk prevention considerations. Methyl isocyanate cooler was taken out of service months before despite high heat and Indian summer temperatures. The emergency vent scrubber that they had, which was an attempt to control things, just in case, they had that was shut down for repairs. The net effect of the release was over 5,000 killed, 2,400 immediately, possibly injured an additional 10,000 or more. There is a YouTube video on that. It takes about an hour, but raises sharp points, and it's well done. Personal interviews. The net result of that was that, I'm going to go back to that slide for just a second. The net result of that was that Warren Anderson, who was the CEO of Union Carbide at the time, had a criminal citation for murder charged against him, and the Indian government tried to extradite him from the United States, stand trial for murder. Warren Anderson retired. EPA came through because they were upset with Union Carbide, and as a direct and indirect result, Union Carbide no longer exists because they went through EPA went through with an extremely fine-tooth comb. All right, we're running short on time. So, Texas City Refinery fire and explosion in 2005. This was caused primarily by a lack of maintenance, poor procedures, and other problems. I've described what happened here. 20 people occupying a trailer at the time were killed or injured. Poor maintenance activity. 6 plant managers in 6 years. Maintenance failure on repair and sensors. Shortcut procedures. Casual attitudes toward safety. 15 people killed, 80 injured, damage in the tens of millions of dollars. Deepwater Horizon, Chernobyl, and lots of others. There is one other event that I do want to touch on, and that is back in 1975, there was a fire at the refinery, Philadelphia, by the airport. It grew very large very quickly, and because of poor drainage in an adjacent tank to where this fire was being fought, the diked area that the firemen were working in was actually filling with gasoline. It was covered with foam until it wasn't. And as a result, 8 firefighters killed, 14 injured, and I think 2 fire trucks. One of the worst cases. Is it a black swan? Sure. The point is, large failures don't occur in isolation, but they are a collection of minor events which lead to bigger events. I could go on and talk about what happened with Atlanta when they had a small fire. It caught some piping that had been stored, plastic piping which had been misstored under a bridge, and it caused that section of I-85 to fail. The lessons here are when you design or build, ask yourself what can go wrong. Let your imagination run, temper it with a little bit of reality. List your scenarios, review them, and determine how they can be prevented simply. The final thing is that remember, when we design a better class, something to be foolproof, nature invents a better class of fool. That's all I have. I'm going to say thank you very much and turn it back to Rochelle.
Thanks, Dave. If all the attendees can enter in the passcode for today, which is unplanned. Also, just to remind you that if you are applying for CLE credit, you must attend for the full 60 minutes of the presentation, and you must complete the survey at the end of the program. Unfortunately, we only have time for one question. So the question is, do you believe it's prudent to set aside a percentage of annual profits in an interest-bearing account for Black Swan events if some catastrophic events are not covered by commercial insurance?
Absolutely. Absolutely. In some cases, for example, depending upon your activity, if you, let's say, for example, were operating a landfill, EPA would make you produce certain bonds that would provide for the closure of the landfill. This is not a bad idea at all. We need to be thinking in terms of what can go wrong, how it could go wrong, and what type of business we're really in. How do we best protect that?
Thanks, Dave. In addition to being your best source for testifying and consulting experts for the past 60 years, TASA also offers free interactive webinars, expert-written articles, research reports from expert witnesses, including the Challenge History Report 2.0, and Expert Profile 360. I want to take this opportunity to thank everyone for attending, and most especially Dave Russell for his time and effort in creating this presentation. If you'd like to speak with Dave, or if you would like to speak with a TASA representative regarding an expert witness for a case that you're currently working on, please contact TASA at 1-800-523-2319. One of my colleagues will be following up with you regarding your feedback on today's presentation. This concludes our program for today.
Thank you all.